All right, cool. Well, so today I just wanted to give, it's more of a rendering workshop than a tutorial because I wanted to provide some background to renderings, sort of why we do them, how they historically became a thing, and then talking about the different styles of renderings that I see today, and then how those sort of inform how you would make those. I spent a lot of time in Enscape when I was working professionally, and so I'm very familiar with that tool. And I think there's a lot of things that you can produce out of it, and it's not just photorealistic renderings, but I think there's opportunities for more of the sort of the trendy collage style or things beyond the photorealistic lens. And so what my understanding is there hasn't been a lot of teaching of rendering in the program. So like most of you, if you've done it, you kind of had to learn on your own. Is that the case? Okay. So hopefully, yes, I'm recording. And so this is recorded. So if you want to come back and rewatch or whatever, that's an option. Okay. Well, I guess that's just the background on I guess what I'm hoping to do with this lecture. And I'm not going to basically like there's so much to rendering that I want to just mainly get like this is a way to get everyone started in thinking about the right questions and what sort of questions you need to ask before you get started with putting together the rendering, because depending on what you want, you might want to it's important to know what you want before you do it, because then there's certain steps you need to take to get there. So I'll get there in a second. But I think renderings, I guess the reason why I wanted to provide some history in renderings is because they're sort of a cursed like topic in architecture, because I think architects have a really love-hate relationship with them, because they're a very powerful way to sell a building to the public or a client, and they're often really exciting. And a good rendering can be really provocative and can get you, can go through like a lot of the internet architecture media. And so they're a really interesting tool in terms of like generating hype and showing kind of the potential of architecture. And usually whenever you want to get something built, you start with a rendering to kind of entice a client to kind of bite on it. And so this is a rendering that MVDRV, which is a Dutch firm, they put together. I think it must have been last year, and it's for this like hill in London that's by this arch, and it was finally built this summer, and this is what it ended up looking like. And so it was like a total failure. It was a big controversy, and I just wanted to show this because I think that renderings are really they're like like a story that we tell, and we do it through an image. And so much of the realities of what it takes to make an image a reality in the built form, you don't, there's this like mismatch here. And so I mean, when you look at this image, it's like, it's like completely public. You can just go up the stairs. There's a line, but you can just go up. And in reality, I think it costs like money to buy a ticket to go to the top to get a view. And then they had to fence it off because kids would climb up, and then because you have to pay money, it's like a safety hazard. And also people get cut the line. So there's a lot of like the reality that wasn't present in the image here. So I just want to show this because I think renderings kind of are problematic, but they're also really powerful. And so I think renderings early on were as a way of adding shadow to elevations and other orthogonal drawings. And so and so adding a shadow sort of created this effect of reality, and it started making these drawings seem like they could be a real building. And so much of it was about like an understanding of shadow and understanding of form and shape. And so rendering was like very much a skill that you would work on and you develop, and you'd have to understand light, shadow, sun, and how to draw it onto the buildings. And so like architects would practice. And so this is a photo of a plaster cast on a wall with a light, and then architects could practice drawing the shadow as it appeared on the wall. And so it was very much like a skill and a technique that was done by hand. And I think a lot of times, and especially in the Beaux-Arts, which is the school in Paris that was really influential in the neoclassical style, teaching rendering was a really important aspect of the education. And they called it the science of shadows. And it started with like this idea of predicting the shadow started a lot with engineering students, and it started working its way to architects. And so the Beaux-Arts school, I'm not going to really get into the school itself, but mainly just the style, was this eclectic neoclassical architecture. And it was very much about the architects showing off their knowledge of different historical styles and different ways of combining them in very novel ways. And so very often the architect was responsible for showing off, like, this Greek pediment here, the Baroque dome, and so there's in the Claudian window. So there's just a lot of different styles going on here. And so the idea is that you would have these very detailed drawings that would be showing off all these different eclectic sources and textual references to historical architecture. And then you would render it with shadows. And so, and that would start to make it real and bring it to life. And so rendering was a really, really huge part of the Beaux-Arts school, and it was very much a part of how architects learned at the time. And it took a lot of time, because this may look small on the page, but I mean they're like huge elevations. Like, they'd probably fill up this whole wall. And so they had this crazy atelier system in the Beaux-Arts where they would basically have a pyramidal structure of the school. And so students would start out and they'd be competing with each other for spots in the next stage. And the students that didn't make it to the next stage would basically have to become the helpers for the students that did. And so there's this whole system of students and then their helpers making these giant architectural renderings of the different elevations and plans and drawings and things like this. And so there was a lot of labor involved with these drawings because they took a lot of time, and they were meticulously crafted. If you look at this, I mean, it's just like the details are just sort of stunning. To imagine like a 19-year-old student putting this together with the help of all these helpers. And I feel like there's a really interesting parallel here too between in a contemporary firm environment, there's a lot of younger staff end up, doing a lot of the renderings for firms and sort of spending their whole time working on that and that aspect of the architectural project. And there is sort of a distance of rendering from the actual act of putting together construction drawings and understanding how the buildings come together versus making images to sell buildings. And I think the other comparison to contemporary times is the idea of these render farms, like large firms like OMA or SOM they'll hire out firms that are specifically designed to make renderings. And so they're even farther away from the building process, where they just make the images of the buildings that these firms put together. And so I think there's this really interesting sort of course through history of how much time it takes to put these together and sort of the relative value in architecture. And so even the plans were rendered too, and these were often the place where you would walk the client through the building. And the way they drew it, the gesture of the hands, the shadows started to mimic the movement through the building. And then they called these the march, which is a French term for, I think, walkthrough. And you can see how this sort of idea of a walkthrough is being proliferated differently through digital media, where you can actually have a fly through the building with the rendering software and things like that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more with Enscape, because that's something that you can do there. And so fast forward to modernism and the architectural avant-garde movement. And so there was this new interest in mixed media and using collage, and they really thought of using collage as a way to mimic the assembly method of industrial production. And so it was this sort of ready-made collage materials that they could come together to create this very radically flat image. And so this is a Mies van der Rohe image of the convention hall in Chicago, if anyone's driven by that in Lakeshore Drive. And then here's another one that Mies did. I think these are sort of interesting parallels, because this is completely filled the page, versus this one's very selective and the material they use, and there's a lot of white space. And so the more restrained quality starts to speak maybe a little bit more concisely about the architecture and what they're trying to communicate. And then even the more radical architects of the 70s, like Super Studio, Super Service, were big advocates of collage and pushed it to levels of where the architecture became almost surreal and psychedelic, and was able to kind of create different spaces that wouldn't have been possible in the same way with like the Beaux-Arts rendering style that we were talking about before. And so collage is an aspect of rendering that I think took a departure from like the rendered shadows. But meanwhile, this was all happening. There was still this interest in shadows and drawing them, and there was an interest also in automating it. And so there was a lot of technology used in photogrammetry, which is like a study of photos and how to like basically create them and mimic them. And so there's these analog systems of being able to draw the shadows where these people would be basically like have all their every single like limb on a pedestal and like moving things. And I won't really get into like how this works because to be honest, I don't really understand how this works, but this was something that people used. And eventually, the computer-generated renderings became more and more a thing. And especially in the 70s, for whatever reason, University of Utah was like a hotbed for rendering technology. And so a lot of innovations kind of came out of that space. And I think this marks a really big change where renderings was instead of like a way of understanding shadows and sun patterns and how that affects a building form, thinking about how that gets basically turned into a software protocol where the computer itself is rendering light and shadows by simulating the sun through ones and zeros. And so this starts to create a different way of doing renderings, and a lot of the skill involved with that, rendering shadows and understanding how shadows worked, changed. And so, if you wanted to change the shadows, you can just move the sun, which is something that, you could do that with the hand-drawn shadows too, but it's a little different, right? You can't just move the sun. And I think just to summarize, like the big kind of idea about renderings in a philosophical sense is phenomenology. And I'm not referencing the architectural style of phenomenology with like Peter Zumthor or Scarpa, like those critical regionalist people, but more so that like there's the study that it's less about whether the building is real, but more so about the philosophical principles about human cognition from the way these appearances are experienced. So it's very much about communicating the experience of a space, whether it's real or not real, and I think renderings often serve this purpose. And lately, I think when I don't want to go all the way back, but I think this status of renderings being able to do this is up for grabs because if you look at that first image of the Marble Arch project, I don't think renderings really did a good job of communicating this the way that building would be experienced. But again, maybe there's some other examples, and I'll talk about some different rendering styles that I think maybe pose interesting a different way of experience than the photorealistic renderings. And so the last thing I want to end up with, and I guess this is getting to this point, is this amazing article that Kate Wagner, who's an architectural critic, if anyone's familiar with McMansion Hell, she runs that blog, but she wrote this great article about PR architecture, and it's this idea, and these PR architectures are like fueled by these amazing renderings. And so where's Jacob? Yeah, this is that big project they did like a seasteading thing, but it talks about architecture for the click economy, a product of the internet age, of short attention spans, and a constant uncritical drive towards the new and shiny. PR architecture is the inevitable result of an image-driven, buzzword-laden media atmosphere where big ideas and sumptuous imagery are rewarded time and time again with attention clicks opportunities over the work of up-and-coming or more critical subversive practitioners. And so the idea that these flashy renderings can capture up a lot of buzz and media attention, and there's really not any substance to them. And I think, and this is really done in the context of the pandemic and the idea that like maybe like, we just need to get shipping containers to build more hospitals, and this idea that these like very simple solutions that can be shown with renderings actually don't really have much to say about the real big problems in the world. And do you all know Acon? Yeah, okay. So Acon has a plan. There's Acon City that is being developed, in Senegal, which is pitched as running on Acoin, which is Akon's own cryptocurrency. And so they're planning on breaking ground soon. And I just want to show you this an example of the most ludicrous idea of a city. And I don't know how Acoin is going to get value. There's a lot of questions about whether this is like a real thing, but you can see how they use the flashy rendering to start to show this experience of a city that could happen, and how this sort of, built, like, I don't know if Akon's a billionaire, but very wealthy, and how this sort of city can start to solve problems on the African continent. I'm not really sure how this works. I don't really know Akon's relationship with Senegal, but I guess I wanted to show like this like strange power that renderings have, with like generating hype and getting people excited about something. And so I don't want to like leave with like renderings are stupid, you shouldn't do them. But I think there's a power to be acknowledged about renderings, and I think that all your projects could benefit more or less to a rendering, because there's a reality to it, that it starts to present a reality that can be experienced. And so I guess that was just kind of a brief history of renderings. Is there any questions about that before I kind of get into more practical things? Okay. So the way that I think of rendering styles, I guess right now I'm thinking of like maybe three, and these are the three rendering styles that I'm familiar with, and I can help teach you if you're wanting to go in any of these routes. And so the first one, I think the most obvious one, is the photorealistic style. And this is the kind of style that's proliferated by like OMA, a lot of the really big firms that work with these like large towers and bankers and financial institutions. And so this is done by OMA for 88 Seaport, which I think is in Philadelphia. And I think one thing just to realize about these renderings is they take a lot of work, and they take a lot of time in post-processing. And when I say post-processing, I mean that's like you capture the render, and then you bring it into Photoshop or some other software, and then you make a lot of tweaks to it to get it to read right. And I think one thing that makes these photorealistic renderings work is contrast, and like how your eye goes across the page. And so you can see that they did this cut here, and that's really like the most important part of the building, in addition to the sort of human scale street and how it fits into the context. And you can see how they use the sky. There's a dark sky here, and there's a lighter sky here, and this is warmer, and it almost brings your eye across the image left through the cut, and then almost down here, and then you come back. Now you're reading the lobby space here, and then maybe you go up and read the whole thing again. And so like a lot of photorealistic renderings is about how do you bring your eye across the page? What are the important things that we want to see, especially in an image where we're just showing a single building? There's a lot of information here about the facade, the cut, the street level, the lobby, what's going on inside the building. And so a lot of that's done by contrast, light and dark, color, warm and cool. And so there's a lot of techniques here that are being used, and I'll get more into the composition later, but I just want to reference that this is a very popular style, and it's very effective at kind of communicating an image of what a building could be.
Could you tell what software you're using?
I would say V-Ray and Photoshop, but I think you could make this in Enscape too. It's just.
They probably started with like Revit or Rhino, and then went into.
Yes. Yeah. They started with a 3D model, and then they brought into a rendering software, either V-Ray or Enscape, and then brought into Photoshop. Good question, Mary. And then the other style that I think has been really popular, especially in the last 6 or 7 years, is the digital collage. And so this style I think is really interesting, and it's sort of a counterpoint to the photorealistic style, because it's not trying to be shiny, new. It's really flat. It really reads as an image. It's trying to show its artifice, that you're not actually seeing the real thing. You're seeing a representation of the thing. And one of the, I guess there's a book called Digital Collage and Dirty Realism, and you can see one of the things that's really interesting about these is they show like sort of the spaces it's lived in. And you can see this must be some sort of artist studio or maker workshop. And you can see there's things on the floor. There's like, you can tell the table's used. There's this hook that's hanging down. There's like mismatched furniture. And so there's a sense that there's like a realism to it. And And the other thing that I think is I want to note too is not only is there a realism, so there's these like collaged elements, but also the difference between how this is at a like a heroic angle, and so you can see the other side of this building there, and that like helps the image be very dynamic, and so the lines are all sort of cutting across the page. Versus with this collage rendering, you can see everything sort of straight, on face, and that makes it really. And there's a reason that is it's really easy to actually collage these elements onto Photoshop. And so, in the way that I would come around to doing this is that I would render it in Enscape and then start to collage these textures on top of that using a material map, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I guess I want to just mention that this sort of how everything is really flat and facing the camera, parallel to the camera, is a really important aspect of this digital collage method because that's sort of how you do it. And so there's a few firms like Dogma is a really good reference point for this kind of style. They're maybe the first people to do it. And there's another firm called Fala Atelier. They're based in Portugal, and they have a fantastic style as well. And they pull a lot of these elements from paintings. And so a lot of the furniture, like the plants, the trees, those things are pulled from paintings. And then they would just take an image. I know their process because I saw them give a lecture, but they just take an image of a space. And usually their spaces, again, everything's parallel to the camera. And they just Photoshop materials on top of it. And so that's one way to do it. It doesn't require a lot of modeling. But again, they usually start with existing structures because Portugal has a lot of existing like housing stock. But that's just another style of digital collage. And a lot of this thinking originates in this book by Jesus Vasallo, and he talks about this like seamless digital collage and dirty realism in contemporary architecture, and how this style starts to inform the built projects. And I'll talk about that after this next one. And so the last one I want to talk about is like post photorealistic. I don't really have a better term for this, but this is a really interesting style where it's using the render engine and it's using the same style, like the same workflow as a photorealistic rendering, but instead it's more diagrammatic. So you can see that these people, they're rendered in like chrome, and so they still reflect shadows, and you can still give them a sense of being in the space. But again, they're not real people. They're not trying to be real people. And then you can see how a lot of the buildings are rendered in clay and white, like it's almost like a foam core model. But then the lights are pink, and so you really get a sense that what's important here is the alley and what's happening in this alley space. And you can start to see inside the windows, and so it starts to pare away the burden of trying to be photorealistic, and it's able to just distill on a single idea. So it's much more diagrammatic, but I think it's a very effective way of communicating. Another example is by Office CA. They're like an academic firm. And they did a competition called Noodle Soup for the Ragdale Foundation, and so this is another example of a post photorealistic style where it looks sort of like a video game where the people are rendered in all white. They're not trying to like have any sort of identity beyond just being like the idea of a person. And then you can see how like there's starting to be elements of drawing on here where the lines of the trees are projected on the plan. And so it's starting to like merge a few different ways of drawing. And so it's like doesn't have the burden of trying to be photorealistic, but it's using a render engine to communicate the idea of the space and what it's like to experience it. So those are kind of the three styles that I see. And I think it's important, especially for the digital collage, to like have an idea of what kind of style you want to achieve before you start, because it starts to determine how you would compose your image and what sort of view you would take. And so just a real quick question. Is this a real place or a rendering? Yeah, who thinks it's real? No. Thanks, Dick. Who thinks it's fake? Okay. Yeah, it's fake. But it looks pretty real, doesn't it?
I wish
Um,
it was real.
yeah, this is a really cool artist who does a lot of like really sort of psychedelic renderings. I have their website here too. And then, okay, this one. Is this a real building or a collage?
Who thinks it's a collage?
Who thinks it's a real building? So like half and half. It's a real building.
That was fun. I wish we could do that all day.
Yeah. But I guess the reason why I wanted to show you this is that if you start to design in collage and you design in that rendering form, it almost starts to create its own logic, and then your architecture is going to be very orthogonal, very flat, and it's about these like sort of collage surfaces on top of each other. And so that depending on where you are in the design process, they start to have an impact on the final outcome.
Do you think that photo was like altered after?
Probably, yeah. But I think there's a reason why they like. I mean, I think like that first photorealistic image, like with OMA, they would never take a picture of a building straight on like this. And so this firm is really interested in that flatness, and so they would take a picture like that. And so I think that's what that book I was showing you earlier is talking about is this relationship of architectural photography to how we design buildings for the photograph or there's like this weird relationship between photograph and building. So this is just I guess an example of a kind of an outcome that you can get if you really are excited about a certain style of rendering and you want to use that as like the basis of your design. And so is anyone familiar with this website, Visualizing Architecture? Okay, it's a really, really good resource. It's so good, in fact, that I kind of just I took some of their images for this presentation just because they just did a great job and I be better than anything I could put together. And I'll share this a PDF of this presentation on the box or the arena, and so you can access these links. But they have a lot of really amazing tutorials, and so they had one about composition that I just want to talk about really quick because when you start selecting a view, it's really important how you do that and how you think about the composition because I think the success of a rendering is really dependent on how effectively you show what you're trying to show. And so one of like the easiest ways to compose anything is using the rule of thirds. And so you just basically divide your image into 9 squares, and you basically can put, try to put like an important element, in maybe one or two of these where those thirds cross. And you can do it in different ways. So like you can see the horizon line is located on the bottom third here, which is really important where you locate the horizon line. And if you wanted to fly through, you could locate the horizon line on the top third, and so you get kind of a higher bird's eye view. And then even like it's really good even for like up close interior renderings. And you can see how like having something really important like this space start to align with this that third. And so it's a very easy way to think about your space, especially when you're in Enscape and you're just like walking around trying to like think about rule of thirds and what you're trying to show is I think important. And the other thing too is thinking about the vanishing point. So if you use a 1-point perspective in your drawing, trying to think about having everything sort of converge at the vanishing point, that's something important. And so that means all the lines that are being of the building are kind of converging here. And so that's where the viewer's eye will naturally go. And so keeping that in mind is one way to kind of direct attention. Because I think renderings are so much about directing a viewer's eye to exactly what you're trying to show. And another good tip is trying to making sure that you have the horizon line and the height of the people's heads the same, because that just basically means that your eye line is like equal with the horizon line you're seeing. And so having the horizon line and like being at the height of the people on the ground kind of gives it that sense of continuity, and it makes it seem like a real photo, like a real experience that you would have if you were standing in this space as if it was real. And then the other thing is making sure that your vertical lines are straight. And so naturally, like with our eyes, it would skew, like if you were looking up. But in a rendering, you can construct it any way you want. And having the straight vertical lines just makes it really plain and clear to understand. And I'll show you how to do that in Enscape. But that's just something that's really helpful and maybe not intuitive at first, is when you're walking around, if you don't have your lines straight, sometimes it's hard to notice.
The other thing that this one shows that's a parallel to architectural photography is showing the building from the base to the top. So like from the feet to the ground, showing the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that sometimes that's a really good way to do it, is to show the whole building at once. And I think like in architecture firms, clients usually like to see the whole thing at once, and so that's always a good technique. But that doesn't mean that you can't like zoom in on one thing specifically. Like if, for example, like if this balcony is really important, you could just have a rendering of what it's like to be on the balcony. But then, don't expect that rendering to explain the whole building. And I think just being really specific about what kind of things you're trying to show with each image, and not just showing images to show images. Okay, and so these are some like renderings I pulled from the Enscape website, and I just thought we could maybe talk through the composition real quick. I don't think these are particularly good, so I think there's like some things to critique. I guess I'm curious, like, if we're looking at this, is there anything that we're noticing that's sort of weird?
Hideous clock.
I guess to me, the like be applied to become a focal point, right?
Yeah. What do you think is the focal point? Like, what is this person trying to show?
See like what be the window it's off, so it's on the window.
Yeah. Like, yeah.
So it's more on the break.
That one wall section is material and everything else. That's what I'm drawn to. Instead, it should be that window in that space. Instead, in front of you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It seems like it's like you're trying to show that space, but then you can't even see it because like the sink is in the way. It almost seems like we need to like shift over. And the clock is, yeah, like way too big, and that wall is way too big. And so I think this is an example where like the field of view is too big, and so it's skewing the sides where I think Sam, you're right, where the fridge appears too big, and then this brick wall appears too big, and so the image isn't really working.
The lens length is too long as well.
Yeah. And so so I think there's something that is like wrong with how this is composed, so it's not working. What about this one? You're saying the building lines are straight up and down?
Yeah, it looks like it's been face tuned.
Yeah, that's a good eye, Stuart. You said face tune?
It's sorry, Instagram joke.
Oh.
That trees going half the building.
Yeah, it's like finish off the building with.
And then half, and the other half of the drawing is sky. So you really see like the third what you're trying to cover.
Yeah, well, I don't know why they put the tree there. But yeah, no, right on. Yeah, the tree's covering half the building, and then I think all the vanishing points are like leading over here to like this rock. Is that like why is the rock important? I mean, maybe they want to show like the relationship to the street, and you can sort of see people like walking on it, but then the rock's in the way. Yeah, so I think this is like important. Is like what are they trying to show? It's really unclear. It just seems like they just like wanted to show the building, and they didn't really think about how to compose it, and so it's all good observations. Okay, how about this one? Yeah. Right, except for the lights.
Same.
Mm-hmm.
And with the black shadow underneath, like down.
Yeah, there's a lot of detail. Like, what do you think they're trying to communicate? Like, what are they, like, what do they want us to walk away from this? But it's like, why, I don't know. I guess it's like, it's hard to read the light from here because you can't really see it. So, I don't know. Yeah. So, but anyway, but I think one thing that's good about this one is I think it's well exposed. It's like the thing that they're trying to show is right there. And I mean, I think it's questionable, like how effectively they're showing the lighting, but
They just want to be the opposite. Instead of it all being like a light tone, and a dark tone, and the light, so it would be
yeah,
the light.
yeah, right, yeah, that would,
Contrast it.
okay. And then this is the last one. I thought I just showed one photo collage.
This is kind of similar, there's a lack of contrast between the sky.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah. She's totally out of scale. The cat's out of scale too.
Their heads, the woman's head is above the horizon, so that's why it seems so.
Yeah. Yeah, no, good. Yeah. She should be like that tall.
It's unclear what the focus
The- This was a published project on some website that I found, and it was about like COVID and like closing businesses. So that's why I think like this sign is like due to COVID. But like, why would you put it?
why would you show the sign?
Yeah, it seems like you'd want to put it like somewhere important. Um, the what?
Your sign.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, those are the four examples I pulled. I just wanted to kind of get us sort of thinking about like what works, what doesn't work, and hopefully that is a helpful sort of like background to like composing the image and trying to figure out what you want to communicate first, and then sort of composing the image to best bring that forward. And then I just included like some resources here. I'll share this PDF with you all, but this has some like websites that have free textures that you can have. So sometimes it's like annoying to like, you're always Googling like concrete texture seamless. And you end up seeing like the same one over and over, or you can't get it. It's not big enough resolution. So hopefully this is some good resources for you all. So I'm just going to go into Enscape now. Okay, so Enscape can be used with Rhino, Revit, SketchUp. And so I'm just using SketchUp here because I had this existing model that I was doing with Interesting Tactics already loaded that I was making visualizations for. So I thought I would just show SketchUp, but it's the same sort of process for both Revit and Rhino. And so it's a pretty basic. Enscape's a really easy. I think it's a really easy to use rendering software, and that's sort of why I'm attracted to it. And I found a lot of flexibility through it, and also it sort of seamlessly integrates with these different softwares. And I think the big thing that I really think is amazing about Enscape is that it's a real-time rendering software. So you can basically like walk around, and then as you make changes in the model, it'll automatically load here. As long as your model is not too big, it won't take any time to load. But if you have a really big model, it might take like 15 seconds or so. And so you can like do a lot of things like changing the sun. So there's a lot of like amazing quick ways to like walk through. And I found that like being able to model in SketchUp or Rhino or Revit, and then basically also have Enscape open so that you can sort of start to like walk through what you're modeling is a really helpful like design tool to like basically be able to embody it almost immediately. And so
Does that bend in the trees grow?
yeah, whenever you move, it'll like animate a little bit. So yeah, this is Enscape. How many people have used it before? So a third. So a lot of you are probably already familiar with it. And so, and just as like a brief overview, the materials that are used in Enscape are from like a material browser in SketchUp or in Revit. If you have the material browser there, it'll just correspond between those. And so as you make changes in the model with the materials, it'll update in the rendering. So if I like take this wall and I paint it red, we can go in here and that's red. So it's like super fast and efficient like that. So I'm going to undo that. And then there's like there's different like things that like Enscape has different assets. So for example, there's Enscape objects, which I've never used sound source, but you can add lighting into your model. And so like if you want to add a sphere, you can just add it and then it'll make the sphere in your model. And then that'll emit light. So if I just like jump that up, we should be able to see the light source there.
And do you often use light sources or just like the global light from the model?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I would if for an outdoor space, you don't really need to use light sources. But if you're starting to render an interior view, you really need the light sources to illuminate it. And so you can see like it's sort of dark in here compared to the outside and the inside of the space. So having those light sources is really useful. And then there's also these the asset library, which is actually pretty powerful. And so all these trees that I have are basically from the asset library. All the people are from the asset library. And so you can import all these different models into your renderings. And these are really like amazing in terms of like talking about realism in renderings and like how do you make spaces feel lived in, or how do you make spaces feel alive? And like you can add animals. I'm curious if there's a horse. They have butterflies. But I'm sure you could find your own horse model. I don't think they have one. And so the trees, the plants are very like good, and depending if you need like a specific like I was working on airports before, and so there's like a few suitcase models that we were using a lot. So that's like a thing that's really useful. And let's see. And then I think Enscape also has like a material editor. I actually have not used this too much, but what's nice about this is you can basically take all the materials from SketchUp, or I think this probably is in Revit too. I haven't seen it yet, but you can start to add more detail to it. Like if you want it to be more metallic or more rough, specular, transparent. And so you can start like customizing the materials a little bit more to do more what you want. And they have like different like ways of different types of materials. So like carpet, clear coat, foliage, grass. As you can see that like the way that the grass is rendered is that you can see all the blades, like they actually have like a texture to it, which I think is really nice. And it makes it feel like a real lawn as opposed to like that really cheesy grass texture that you would see in like old video games. Let's see, anything else? Yeah, so I guess that's like the modeling Enscape interface. I know I'm going like pretty quick through it. Is there any questions about any of that? Okay. So I know it should be fairly intuitive, but if you're starting to work on this and you have questions about like basic stuff like that, I'd love to help you. So just like keep me in the loop.
Can you talk about how you would choose the frame for this rendering?
Yeah, I'll talk about that. Yeah, I will. And so you can like walk around and you can like fly. So like this is this wing navigation mode, so you can fly mode or walk mode, and flying can like help you get like high in space. And so you can get different like vantage points. And and when you open Enscape for the first time, you're probably not going to get this like nice, like balanced color vision, and you're going to have to do some editing in the visual settings. And so the visual settings are like basically like the tool for basically manipulating the light, the color, the outlines, the field of view. And so I'll get into your question in a second. But there's like a few basic styles, so you can like turn it to, hopefully my computer doesn't crash. So so you can like, there's different modes of renderings. And so this is like a clay model where everything becomes white. And this could be really helpful for like process, or if you don't want to get, if you're not like, if your model is not ready to start thinking about material and you want to present it, and you just want to focus on the form and the construction, a white mode could be really useful. And then outlines is like basically controls like the lines on top of the building, and so you can get like a more cartoon look on it. It doesn't really work so well on people, like the people get really weird looking, but if you don't have people, you can kind of get that nice like cartoon outline look. I usually like leaving like outlines at like 17% just because they add some definition, but you can't actually read them. And then there's the camera projection. So they have the perspective, which is where you get the lines that are not straight. And so I typically use 2-point, which like sort of straightens everything up. But you can also get orthographic if you want to do like a rendered plan or a rendered elevation. The Enscape allows for that as well. And then there's the rendering quality here. And then there's like the camera settings. So this is like, imagine like Mary, you were talking about like the lens. This is like basically like if you were there taking the photo, this is the kind of settings that you would have on the camera. So like exposure can like, change like how much light the camera goes into the camera, how much doesn't. And so this is, I never use auto exposure because I like being in control of it. And then field of view is like the camera angle. And so you can like bring it all the way out, which is like maybe more of a wide angle lens. You could bring it really close in, so it's like much more flat. I typically go with like anywhere between like 58 and 67. That's not the right one. Because that's sort of close to what the human eye perceives. But if you needed to show something more, then like if for whatever reason like 63 wasn't enough to show what you're trying to show because you're trying to show like the whole building, a wide angle is more than appropriate. And so I think it's really up to the project. I've never really used depth of field, but that like if you wanted to get like some weird effects of the camera, you can do.
Focuses in the foreground and down the background.
Yeah, I don't know. I have never used that, but thanks, Mary.
Well, they're just these. It's like it's interesting to me how it's anachronistic. They're coming from analog cameras, and they're just translating to digital images.
So this maybe makes more sense here, where you like want to blur out. Yeah. Anyway.
Focus on the wall.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's like a ton of like image settings, and I don't know if I want to get into all of these because like there's saturation, which can, obviously can like, and some of this like image corrections you can do in Photoshop too. So it's sort of up to you where you want to like spend your effort. But if you wanted to like use only Enscape and not have to do any post-processing, this might be a way to save some time.
Is that a realistic goal? Like, do you think most people will use Photoshop with Enscape?
I think if you really want like full control over what you're presenting, I think Photoshop's really useful. And I'll talk about the workflow because it's really important in a second. And then there's like the sun, and the ambient brightness is like the light around your character model. And so that's like, it's more, I think, more impactful in interior spaces, but you can see how it lightens up a little bit. And artificial light brightness is like the lights. So if you have like modeled like a light fixture, artificial light brightness, like increasing that will make the artificial lights brighter. Like, I guess it's sort of intuitive like that. Sun brightness is important too because that can really make a huge impact on what you're looking at. And then sky output, like you can have a white background. So if you didn't want to have to deal with the sky, and then you can like have tons of clouds and like mess up their variety. I typically don't really like clouds because I think they just add a lot of distraction. But I think the Enscape clouds are kind of nice because they're a little bit more subtle, and you could go like completely overcast, which is sometimes nice. And the thing that's interesting about clouds too is they do block sunlight. So if you didn't really want any shadows on your model, because you can see shadows, you could just add a lot of clouds, and then that'll block. It'll just be diffuse light. So that there's some like interesting techniques with that. So I'll get to the output in a second. And so this is like a model that is of an accessory dwelling unit. So it's designed for like this like auxiliary house on a lot of an existing single family home. So the whole project was like this like life cycle. So like the people that live here, like when they age, they like move out and they live in this second house that has a kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, and it's ADA accessible. So you can really age in there, whether you're in a wheelchair or you have any sort of like issues with walking. And so the idea is, and then the idea is that your children move into your old house, and so there's this like relationship between the extended family. And so when you're like deciding to make a view, I always like to walk around a lot and try to think of what I want to show. And for this image, what we ended up doing is we really wanted to show the relationship of this house and like the kind of courtyard quality that this ADU makes with this other house, and how this becomes like a shared space where like the elderly and the young family can kind of all interact here while still having their own space. And so I think like rule of thirds is sort of how I thought about it. So like having this strong corner here, that's 1/3, and then having kind of this sort of activity happening relative. And so it's sort of, and I mean, I can move around to get that more closely aligned, but I think that's just sort of one way to think about how you want to communicate that design. And so this is like a more of a photorealistic rendering, but I also put together like, if you want to do like more of a post photorealistic look, where you start to like simplify that relationship. And so I made like the floor is all red for like the ADU, the blue surface is like where the existing house is, and then I imagine like, okay, well, what if there's this like purple surface, red and blue make purple, that is sort of in between, that like they can share, and you can see like people from both red and blue people can like occupy that. So this is like, I'm not gonna say this is my best work. I did this really quickly last night, but I just wanted to show that like there's a way to like really simplify a rendering down, so you don't have again the burden of trying to like photorealistically show everything, but just show exactly what you want. And these are the Enscape like blocky trees, which I actually hate. So I think you can make your own like entourage. Like you don't have to rely exclusively on the Enscape assets. But this is just like one way to think about the composition. And so I think there's lots of different ways to like, walk around. You could communicate that in a number of ways. Maybe you want to look, from the house here and show it, things like that. So, is there any questions about composition or how to like manipulate like the Enscape environment to get what you want? It's something I know it's helpful to like get into it yourself, and you can start asking these questions. So it's okay if you don't have any questions. So I'm gonna go quickly back to here, and I'm gonna show you how to like export and like what my workflow is for Photoshop, because there's some really smart people that kind of taught me, and some of you may be familiar with like how to use linked images rather than like embedded images. But so let's just say this is our image. You'll go to visual settings, and you want to make sure that you click export object ID, material ID, and depth channel. These are really, really useful. And then you can choose your like aspect ratio and like how much like resolution you can handle. And I think this is really up to your computer. So once you like get like your image set, you can, I would recommend like making a scene from it. And so you can, so like you can go to view management, and then you can create a view and then name it. And so this is like in-class tutorial view. And so then you can always come back to it, which is really important. Again, another really important thing. So like I can move and then I click here and it'll bring me back to this view. And so, and as long as all your other settings are the same, you can basically like replicate the same view. And one technique to make your settings the same is you can create a preset. So you could just say like in-class tutorial preset. And then you'll create that preset. And so if you change any of like the, well, they want you to like, I guess when you make the preset, they want you to like start from scratch. So you might have to like make a preset and then get the settings you want in here so that it's the same. But working is the preset that I was working with before. So once it, I guess I haven't seen activate. But now, so now we're back here. So that all those settings that we came up with to get the view that we wanted are saved here. And so once you have a preset, don't mess with it because it's really, again, helpful to come back to an image. So once you have it set up, you have the view saved, you have all the view settings in a preset, then this image is like ready to go. And so what you'll do is you'll basically take a screenshot and you'll name it, I'll just name this test 1. So you save over it and it'll export it. It'll take a second to export it. And so now it's done. And then you'll go to, not open. So then just make a new one. I'll just do, yeah, web large is fine. Make sure your resolution is 300 ppi, pixels per inch, because that's like printing grade. So 72 dpi to 150 dpi is like good for websites, but if you're going to print it, do 300. And you might even want to like increase the resolution more. But you know, if you increase your resolution and have like a really high DPI, and then you have a large, you know, like 6.4 by 3.6 is not that big, so you might want to go like, you know, 18 by 9 or something. So you have this big board, and then so the key, the thing that I want to really emphasize is like making sure that you link images rather than embed. Because the idea is that you could, when you link the image, so I'll bring the image in, it's linked. And then that way is if you go back to Enscape and you like, let's say you're like, oh, this kid's no good. You delete him and then he's gone. And then you can re-render and then you can just basically like reload, or you could relink to file. And so then any changes you make get like saved. And so then you're not actually destroying any of the images. It gives you the most flexibility and agility going forward. Has anyone done this in Photoshop before? Tyson? Okay. So this might be review then.
I feel like Drew learned that the hard way from like going to Photoshop and having to know that.
Yeah, it's brutal. And then you have to decide if you want to like start over or like try to like fake the change in the Photoshop. So it's not fun. So this is a really good way to do it. Oh, see, I just made a mistake. Oh no, this is linked. Okay, and so you're going to link all the different images. So I actually have never used depth, but I usually use object ID and material ID. And so the really cool thing about these different these image maps is that they like focus on just like the material and they really dumb it down. So let's just say you're looking at this image and you're like, wow, this facade on this ADU is like way too dark. What you can do is you can take the magic wand tool and you can just select this facade here, and then you just highlight that, and then you go to your actual image. And what we do is since it's a linked image, you can't actually change it, but you can add a masking region. So we'll go down here. If you see this dot, it says create a new adjustment layer. And so if we want to adjust the brightness, we can basically create a layer that is just basically like masking here. And because I highlighted that area, it's only going to modify that specific area, so we can turn the brightness down and just change that one image. And so that's really like, I think the power of Enscape is like the ability to render an image and then have those material maps. And so you can go into Photoshop and really like seamlessly start to change very, very specific things in a very accurate way. You don't have to waste time like lassoing all this surface just to change it. And so, and then you're like, well, if I don't want it, you can just turn it off. The image is like, is intact below. And so you can start like making a lot of changes to different things. And so if you wanted like, if you wanted to select all the roof, and if you hold shift, you can select more than one thing. And just keep in mind, be careful with trees. They're kind of a headache because you can see that like now I have to spend a little bit more work to like get all the spaces between the tree. So just maybe think about that. I wasn't that.
There's a way you can select the color.
Oh, yeah.
You can select the-
Yeah, no, exactly. Color range, right? Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Mahal. Yeah, it's good. And you can, and so the fuzziness, maybe you can help me with this, but this basically determines like how much it grabs of that color and like that range. So if you're like, I think if you have fuzziness pretty low, oh, yeah, I didn't have the right. Yeah, so this is another technique to do it, and it could be faster. I just found that sometimes it grabs like other things, but then what you can do is you just take the lasso tool, and if you hold, does anyone know how to do the,
You hold shift to do the minus lasso.
oh, no. It's, you hold shift and,
So you have the plus, I think, is it the control or shift?
Control is more than
Control is minus, and then there's some.
It's like,
Makes
we're
it
doing
minus.
by ourselves, or just like testing it out.
yeah, I actually used to know how to do it. Yeah, maybe it's Alt. Yeah, Alt. If you hold Alt, yeah. It's funny, it's like when you're off the computer, you like are lost, like what keys to press. So if you do Alt, that's another way to like get the exactly the right thing. And so then you can basically, oh, don't do that. You want to do the masking regions. And so if you want to adjust the hue here, maybe we could turn it a different color so it's a green roof. And so you can make some like pretty crazy changes. But you can see I changed a little bit of the facade. And so I think that's like the downside of that color selection tool. Sometimes you lose a little control about what you're selecting. So that's why I guess I typically haven't used it. But I think if you get good with how you change the fuzziness and then using the lasso tool to get things cropped out, that can be a very effective method. So yeah, so that's like the, I guess the basics one, like of how I would like think about like making adjustments to the Enscape output in Photoshop. And another really useful thing to use is to have groups. And so you can have these folders with groups and you can like name them. So you could just like if you're just thinking about like facade, and so you could put all the facade changes in here. And then that would be like, might be helpful to turn specific things off. And so I wanted to show you an image that I put together for this project. And so to me, this was I was like excited to do this because I was like able to kind of push Enscape to make something that I hadn't really seen before. And so this is a little bit of an in between like the collage method and the photorealism. And so what I did is I used the, so this is like the original image. So it's like the photorealistic output that I got. And it's funny, I don't think I ever noticed that I messed up the material here.
I didn't notice that.
Yeah, it's kind of sad to like revisit that and realize I totally missed it. But I took the material ID here, and I was able to basically color code it to match the colors underneath. And so what I'll show you is what I did. And so then I have basically like a cartoon version of the building. on top. And so I was able to get this really radically flat, almost illustration aesthetic. And so I think this is sort of interesting on its own right too. I can bring the people up too. And so the people, and so you can you could get like a really cool, like really flat illustrated quality to it. But what I did is I ended up just doing a hybrid. So this was at like 60%, so I can still get the shadows and still get some of the textures behind it, but also getting that like flat Illustrator quality, because we were designing these ADUs for an idea book that was going to be published for like the general public. And so we wanted to like make the renderings like have a quality of like sort of a illustrative quality, so people didn't think about them too specifically about like thinking about them in a photo way, but thinking about them more like how they would imagine themselves being there. And so it's sort of more like a storybook, if that makes sense. And so that was sort of our approach to how we rendered these. And this is like a way that I think that Enscape is a good way to not just, you can get the photorealistic look if you wanted to. And it's really good at that. But it's also really good at providing a base for other sorts of approaches. And so like if you wanted to do the pure collage method, we can see, I think I have, okay. So if you wanted to just take like a concrete texture, and I know this is sort of lazy, I'm just taking one, but then you'd paste it over here, and then you could basically resize it so that we're trying to get that base. And then I'll just turn the opacity down a little bit. And then we're going to grab here. And then because, so I grabbed that area that we want, but we don't want to delete the area, we want to delete everything around it. So what I'll do is I'm going to take that selection tool and then select the inverse. So we're selecting everything around it. And then we'll bring this back up to like maybe 80%. And then if you delete it, you can get that like sort of like radical flat kind of collage element. And so you can start to build like, so that's what it would look like, but with the Enscape background, you can get a little bit of dimension to it. And so you can still get that flat collage aesthetic that isn't photorealistic, but can get it in a way that is starting to like have this quality. And so this isn't the best model for it because again, I'm looking at an angle, and I think for that sort of digital collage, you want to be looking straight on. But you can basically compose an image in that way to start to get that kind of aesthetic. And so I think this material map is a really effective way of basically breaking down the model and the image into something that you can really start to manipulate and construct. And so this is, I guess this is how I would approach that photo collage thing. And there was a project I did like maybe 5 years ago where I think Tyson, you were looking at it with, it was purely like digital collage. And I went through a lot of work. I went through Rhino, and then I made the model in Rhino, and then I did Made 2D, and then I took the Made 2D and I brought it into Illustrator, and I basically made this, and then I applied materials onto it, and it was the most time-intensive process that I wouldn't recommend anyone. But then when I was like working with Enscape and I was realizing that it automatically made you this, that it was like you could really do anything with this. So I think, I don't know, I guess that's sort of how I see Enscape and how I think it can be a really useful tool, and it really simplifies things. And the last thing I want to say is that you can pretty easily make videos with it. And so like you can basically you press the plus button and then you walk somewhere else. You can press the plus button. I haven't actually worked too much with this, but like so you can like make it actually a pretty effective walkthrough with like very little work if you have the nice model. I wonder what shaky camera does. Okay, so that's if you want that realism. Anyway, that's all I really have. Is that any questions or are you talking about like the BIM?
Like the QR panels and the Oculus stuff.
Oh, I've not done Oculus with Enscape before. I've done it with Unity, but not here. And what do you mean by panel?
Panorama.
Oh,
So like there's an option to do like a QR panel on there where you get a QR code and you can look it up on the internet.
oh, really?
Yeah, they're kind of easy.
No. And so would you just send it to like a client and they could like do it on their own?
Yeah, like up top is a mono panel, and you just press that, and you export the QR code, and then you just have them like, take a picture of it. I don't know.
Oh,
Or do things, do a quote, or no.
oh, it's this one. Oh, and so since it doesn't let you do 2-point, so I can go to perspective.
They don't take lives, they don't get everything done.
No. Yeah, no, I haven't. Thanks for bringing that up. So that's something else you can do. But I feel like it probably requires a pretty good model. Like if I turn around, you can see,
You'll be able to turn all the way down.
yeah. But I mean, yeah. So, and so if anyone is deciding to like you want to make some renderings for your project, I'd be like love to be a resource for you. Whether like if you want to troubleshoot with modeling or Enscape or Photoshop. This is more like an intro. I know like you can't really learn anything until you get your hands on it. So I was just mainly just to expose you to like history of rendering and where it is right now and how we can use it for our own benefit. So, well, if there's no questions, we can go on to the pinups.